In a sea of noise and movement, where wheels rolled, announcements echoed, and people rushed past each other without a glance, one man stood still, not because he was lost, but because he was unseen. The crowd moved around him like water avoiding, a rock, brushing past without acknowledgement, without pause. He was centered in silence, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that whispered success, power, and precision. Yet none of that mattered. A black CEO standing tall in a place meant for prestige was silenced by uniformed ignorance. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't wonder what he had achieved or what he represented. They simply assumed, based on skin, on presence, on the quiet confidence that made them uncomfortable. What they didn't know was that this man, with just one call, held the power to unravel the system they thought protected them. One calm, silent decision would crumble everything they believed was untouchable. But before we begin, take a breath with me. Tell us, where are you watching from? Have you ever felt invisible in plain sight? This story is not just about power. It's about being seen. Elijah Brooks moved through the terminal with the quiet precision of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. At 38, he carried himself with the stillness of a storm that had already passed, its rage long buried beneath layers of discipline, focus, and pain refined into elegance. His suit, a deep navy, double-breasted and flawlessly tailored, fit him like a second skin, but it was his eyes that drew attention, even if people didn't understand why. They were calm, dark, observant, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. He had been born far from marble floors and skyline lounges, in a place where streetlights flickered uncertainly and leaking rooftops dripped through long winters. Dirt roads taught him how to walk carefully. Silence taught him how to listen deeply. Now, he co-owned the very systems that once locked him out. Tech networks, aviation chains, regulatory boards. He didn't brag. He didn't need to. His presence spoke in quiet capital letters. The airport around him buzzed with practiced urgency. Sleek announcements pulsed through the air while people in expensive coats and careless glances moved past security lines, coffee in hand, privilege in posture. The lighting was cold, sterile, white like a surgical glove, meant to feel clean, but it always felt clinical. As Elijah passed, eyes flicked toward him, then away again. Some lingered a moment longer, calculating, suspicious. He walked with deliberate grace, each step neither hurried nor proud. But to them, his stillness was arrogance. His confidence was threat. Karen Willis noticed him the moment he stepped near the first-class queue. Late 30s, blonde hair coiled into a tight bun, her uniform crisp with authority she wore like a weapon. She didn't see a passenger. She saw a question mark, a challenge. Her gaze was a shield, her voice sharp even in silence. Authority to her was armor, not service. And then there was Dale Morton, senior in age and posture, with silver hair and folded arms that had witnessed years of incidents but intervened in none. He stood nearby, silent. The kind of man who had seen women like Karen bark orders before, and had nodded along without ever lifting a finger. He didn't need to speak to show his position. His indifference did the talking. The marble beneath. Elijah's feet gleamed like a promise kept too late. It reflected his polished shoes perfectly, but no reflection could hold the weight of what his journey had cost him. The floor saw the surface. The world saw the surface. Not the man. Not the soul. And still, he walked forward, calm as ever. Just before stepping into the roped-off line, Elijah's phone vibrated. He looked down. The screen glowed. Executive HQ. He stared at it for a second, thumb hovering, then turned it off and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't need to call, not yet. Some lessons, after all, are taught better in silence. Elijah approached the first-class gate with the quiet dignity of a man used to moving through spaces that weren't built for him. He offered a gentle nod to the staff behind the counter, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips, not out of obligation, but as habit. It was a greeting born from years of being forced to soften his presence, to reassure people he meant no harm despite his height, his skin, his certainty. The smile was not returned. Instead, Karen Willis stepped forward with clipped footsteps, her tone sharp before her words even formed. "Excuse me, sir," she said, but it wasn't an invitation. It was a barrier. Her voice carried the practiced chill of protocol, but behind her eyes was something else. Discomfort dressed as duty. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't ask a question at all. She pointed to his boarding pass and narrowed her eyes. This can't be right. Elijah, unshaken, reached into his coat and offered both ID and ticket with the same calmness he had used in boardrooms and government briefings. Karen didn't even glance at the name. She waved her hand dismissively, stepping back as if the documents themselves were offensive. "You can't be who this ticket says you are," she muttered, her voice tight and condescending, like she was explaining to a child why they couldn't sit at the grown-up table. A few feet away, Dale Morton stood with arms folded and eyes narrowed. He didn't speak. He rarely did, but his posture said enough. He had seen moments like this before and never found a reason to stop them. In fact, he'd likely seen Karen do this before, and like always, he let her continue. Passengers slowed their pace. A few turned their heads. A woman in a gray coat pulled out her phone, angling it discreetly. Another man leaned in to whisper something to his partner, their eyes darting toward the unfolding scene. The air shifted, not chaotic, but heavy. Elijah breathed in slowly, his jaw firm, his fingers tight around the handle of his suitcase. His mind reached back without permission, flashes of moments he had buried deep. Being pulled off the stage in middle school when the principal doubted he'd written his own speech. A police officer demanding proof of ownership for a car. His name was on. A banker asking for extra verification, even after seeing his balance. Spaces he had earned. Access he had paid for. And always a wall waiting. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "Why do you think I don't belong?" Elijah asked quietly. His voice didn't shake, didn't tremble. It floated with grace, but beneath it was something colder, something wounded. Karen's jaw clenched. "Because people like you—" She paused, eyes scanning his suit, his stillness, his silence. "People like you don't travel like this." There it was, unvarnished truth wrapped in assumed authority. Not even an attempt to hide the prejudice. It hung in the air like static before a storm. Elijah nodded once. Slowly. The kind of nod that says, "I've heard this before, and I'll hear it again." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and looked at the screen without hesitation. Then, with 2 fingers, he tapped the screen and lifted it to his ear. 1 ring. Elijah held the phone to his ear with the same serenity he'd carried through every step of humiliation. His lips moved gently. almost inaudibly, and the single word he spoke seemed to bend the air around him. "Proceed." He didn't need to raise his voice. Power didn't need volume. Karen's face twisted at the sound, a mixture of confusion and control slipping through her grasp. She lunged forward, hand outstretched to snatch the phone from his grip as if the very act of communication threatened her authority. But Elijah stepped back, his eyes fixed on hers, not with anger, but with the unshakable steadiness of a man who had nothing to prove. She froze mid-reach, caught in the intensity of a gaze that didn't flinch. It wasn't defiance, it was revelation. Seconds passed. The terminal held its breath. Then, from the far end of the corridor, movement. Fast, purposeful, urgent. 3 sharply dressed airport officials pushed through the crowd, their eyes wide with recognition and panic. Behind them trailed staff members, whispering, checking, earpieces, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. The lead official, a woman in her 40s with a badge that read Director of Operations, reached Elijah first, breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Brooks, we had no idea. Please come with us immediately." Her voice was a tremble masked in formality, laced with desperation. Elijah didn't move. His posture remained anchored, his expression unreadable. He didn't glance at the director. His eyes remained on Karen and Dale, who now stood frozen like statues carved from arrogance. "No," he said softly, but the word sliced through the silence like glass and water. "They need to hear it here." His tone wasn't vengeful. It wasn't loud. It was something far worse for them. Controlled. Certain. Karen's shoulders tightened. Dale looked to the side as if searching for an exit in a place suddenly too bright. The marble floor beneath them, so clean and polished moments ago, now seemed to gleam with irony. It reflected Karen's boots, her trembling posture, and Elijah's stillness like a mirror, one that exposed more than appearance. It revealed hierarchy turned hollow, uniforms turned brittle. His calm became a lens through which the terminal now saw clearly that noise could be cowardice, and silence could be strength. The operations director cleared her throat, her voice careful, formal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, projecting to the crowd that had now fully gathered, "we'd like to clarify that Mr. Elijah Brooks is not only a first-class passenger, he is also a board member of the airline's global parent company." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Phones lifted higher, recording. Karen's mouth parted, but nothing came out. Dale turned his eyes downward, the stoicism he wore like armor now cracked and useless. The director continued. "His call initiated a live audit of this terminal. Effective immediately. All flights connected to this gate are being held. Internal reviews have begun." The words echoed like thunder after a lightning strike. Every syllable rearranged the room. Passengers exchanged glances, murmurs grew, and the silence between Karen and Dale thickened like fog. Karen's throat worked as she tried to speak, to explain, to recover a narrative slipping far out of reach, but her voice had lost its edge. It failed her the way she had failed every face she had profiled, every traveler she had doubted. She looked at Elijah now, not as a threat, not even as a passenger, but as something she had never allowed herself to see. A man with power, with dignity, with patience sharper than her suspicion. Dale didn't speak. He didn't even meet Elijah's eyes. Instead, he stepped back, shoulders sinking, as though the very ground beneath his feet had shifted and he no longer knew how to stand. The man who always stayed silent had finally become what he always was. Irrelevant in the face of truth. Matis still hadn't moved. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply existed in a space that now, finally, undeniably, saw him. Not because he demanded it, but because he had made the world stop long enough to listen. Elijah finally stepped forward. Not toward the officials, but into the silence he had carved with precision. His voice remained gentle, but each word struck like a chisel against stone. This audit, it wasn't spontaneous, he began, eyes still fixed on Karen, though his voice carried to the entire terminal. It was my idea. A final test after. Your staff completed your so-called diversity training. Not a checklist, not a seminar. A real-world test. One where the stakes weren't controlled by your boardrooms, but by your instincts. He let that settle in the space between them, and it did. Heavy, undeniable. He turned slightly toward the crowd, now thick with faces, passengers, employees, guards, and strangers who had seen injustice unfold not in theory, but in real time. I didn't come here today as a CEO. I didn't come in expecting special treatment. I came as a customer, just a man with a ticket and a name. His pause was full of ache, because that's where racism still hides, not in your written policies, but in the eyes that scan your line, in the mouths that form "sir" through clenched teeth, in the silence that follows when someone like me steps into a space you never thought belonged to us. His eyes softened, distant for a moment, as if pulling threads from the past. When I was 7, I was pulled out of a public library. I was sitting quietly, reading about galaxies, but the librarian said I didn't look like I should be there, that I made the other kids uncomfortable. He drew a breath. At 16, I was stopped at a gas station while driving my mother's car. The officer said the vehicle looked stolen. I showed ID. It didn't matter. The crowd stood still. The truth had slowed time. Karen's face broke, not in tears, but in collapse. The authority she had clung to now looked small in her hands. She had wielded it like a sword, but now it trembled like paper. Her mouth opened, but her words betrayed her. Nothing came. She stood in the ruins of her assumptions, exposed not by force, but by truth. Elijah didn't sneer. He didn't rise. He looked at her with eyes that had weathered storms far worse than this moment. And he offered no fury, only clarity. We don't always want power, he said, his voice like water over stone. We want peace. But if power is the only language, you understand. He let the words hang. The rest didn't need to be said. Everyone heard it anyway. Everyone felt it. From the back of the crowd, a soft sound broke through, one person clapping, then another. Heads began to nod, not in rhythm, but in realization. The truth had weight, and today it echoed, not through headlines or press releases, but through a man who chose to remain silent until silence became too loud to ignore. Karen and Dale were escorted away before the hour ended, their faces blank, but their futures uncertain. The Federal Review team had arrived swiftly, with questions neither of them had prepared for. Their names, once backed by the safety of structure and routine, now rested at the center of an internal reckoning. The system that had protected them now scrutinized them, and for once it listened not to their version of events, but to the truth they tried to silence. Elijah was approached moments later by senior airline executives, their voices lowered with apology and offers of compensation wrapped in polished courtesy. A private jet was prepped for him, they said. Anything to preserve dignity, to make it right. Elijah simply looked at them, the same stillness in his body, and replied, "No, I'll take the same flight. The one you denied me." It wasn't defiance, it was correction, the kind that didn't scream. It simply walked forward. The terminal, once filled with invisible barriers, now felt altered. Not cured, but shifted. Passengers stood aside as Elijah moved, not out of pity, but out of newfound awareness. The silence that accompanied him now wasn't the cold hush of judgment. It was reverence. Earned. Deserved. Understood. When he finally took his seat in first class, it wasn't triumph that sat with him. It was grace. Outside, the world reacted in ways no boardroom had ever achieved. The videos captured by passengers spread like wildfire on every platform, across every continent. People didn't just see a confrontation. They saw a revelation. They saw a man dismantle quiet prejudice with quieter truth. The footage became more than content. It became conscience. The media called it the quiet shutdown. Not a protest of banners and chants, but of poise and exposure. Days later, Elijah appeared on a national talk show. The audience sat still as he spoke, his voice calm but piercing. "Reform doesn't start in boardrooms," he said, hands gently folded. "It starts at boarding gates, at lunch counters, in waiting rooms, where everyday power meets everyday people. That's where the culture lives. That's where the healing has to begin." The applause came slowly, then rose, because everyone in the room felt what he meant, not just heard it, but Elijah's work didn't end with applause. He returned to a school in the very neighborhood where he'd been told he didn't belong as a boy. He walked through the halls, greeted teachers, then gathered a small group of students and made a quiet announcement. He was donating 10 full scholarships, in the name of Karen Willis. Not to shame her, but to redefine what her name could mean. "Let her name mean more than what she did today," he said. "Let it be a turning point." It was not forgiveness for her. It was investment in those like him, long before suits and power could shield them. And in that choice, Elijah proved something deeper, that real strength isn't just about exposing darkness, it's about planting light in its place. His presence no longer needed to fight to be seen. It now taught others how to see, not with suspicion, not with expectation, but with recognition, with understanding, with change. They thought they saw a man in the wrong place, but Elijah was exactly where he needed to be, not to demand acceptance, but to change the space itself. In a world that too often defines worth by appearances and assumes guilt by silence, he stood still and let truth do what noise never could. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse the system. He revealed it, calmly, powerfully, and permanently. Have you ever been stopped? Not for what you did, but for what you looked like. Have you ever felt the weight of someone else's assumption pressing against your dignity? If so, know this. Your story matters. Your presence matters. And sometimes the strongest protest is presence itself. If this story struck a chord, share it. Let others feel what Elijah made the world feel. Dignity delivered with silence. Change doesn't always come from outrage. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from resolve, from one quiet call that shakes an entire foundation. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon with another story that speaks not in volume, but in truth.